All right. Welcome. Welcome to Virtual VFX, Going Cloud Native, where we have some industry leaders here in order to talk to us about what it's like taking a studio into the cloud and getting production workflows up and running. So Mark, Corbin, Jeff, you guys can unmute and come on camera. I'll go ahead and introduce you. All right, so our first panelist is Corban Gossett. He's a senior product manager at AWS, working on Studio in the cloud. He started his career at Alias Wavefront as part of the original Maya team. Corban then moved into production as a supervising technical director at DreamWorks Animation, with credits on Megamind, Peabody and Sherman, and Trolls. After DreamWorks, Corban joined Nimble Collective, a small startup creating pipeline as a service in the cloud. Now at AWS, Corban continues to help studios realize the power of cloud-based production and virtualized studios. Welcome, Corban.
Thank you.
All right. Next up, Jeff. Jeff Bell was also at Alias Wavefront back in the day, where he helped drive the initial animation features of Maya. Later, he was CG supervisor, VFX supervisor, and an exec at companies such as IDT Entertainment and Stars Animation. Jeff's credits include Everyone's Hero, Hoodwinked 2, and Tim Burton's 9. Recent credits include Ozzy and NextGen as producer. Jeff is now COO of Tangent Studios and CEO of Tangent Labs, where he has seen firsthand the benefits of cloud workflows. And Mark Ross is co-founder of GridMarkets, a cloud platform that simplifies and accelerates compute-demanding workflows, such as animation rendering and molecular modeling. GridMarkets serves large and small studios around the world with projects that are often super time-sensitive and IP-sensitive. So, Jeff and Mark, welcome. I'd also like to introduce Satish Goda. After we start off with a couple of questions that I have for the panel, Satish is going to be fielding questions from the Q&A section over here on Huvo. So as people have questions, just fire them in over there. And after a little bit, we'll switch over and we'll start running through. You can also upvote questions that you want to see answered. So we'll be following along with that. All right, let's get to it. So if it was easy to unlock cloud workflows, we'd be there already. So what are the biggest barriers that you guys have seen that prevent studios from being able to get to the cloud? Jeff, start with you.
So for us, it was basically transitioning all of our tool sets into something that was compatible with, so we're on Amazon, we're on the AWS setup. So it's basically transitioning those tool sets to be cloud aware and looking at some of the managed services that companies like AWS have. So prior to that, we had multiple facilities hooked up. The next step was actually to have the third bit, which was the cloud portion. So it was enabling our tools to actually talk to Amazon services such as S3 and the EC2 services and all the other managed services.
Thanks. Thank you. Mark?
Yeah, so we've hopefully reduced those barriers. And the way we've done it is by creating plugins into the popular 3D tools that studios are using on one end, and then integrating our platform to various cloud providers on the back end. So from the end user's perspective, the studio's perspective, they can be working in their 3D application of choice and activate our plugin, which then allows them to simply direct the submission to GridMarkets, specifying how many machines they want to run on and what configuration of machine they want to run on. And most of it is then automated thereafter. So it's a fairly simple process. But it's been a very complicated thing to engineer, and it's challenging for studios to do that on their own. They need a large technical staff to accomplish that, or they can use something that's already been built. So that's how we've approached it.
Nice. And Cord, what kind of barriers have you seen?
I think part of it is, it's what Jeff was saying. It's your tool sets, it's security, it's kind of getting all over all of that. But a lot of that comes down to change management. The technology is there to be able to move to the cloud. There's studios that are doing it today, and it's possible. But I think a big part of that is just the change management of, somebody coming to, in AWS's sense, coming to the console and going, where do I start? Like, how do I build storage? How do I build my workstations? How do I stream that? And so it's, you know, it's as Mark was saying, it's like, how do we make that process easier? And I think that's a goal of the cloud providers in the industry, is to help make that more approachable. Because once people get over the change management, then it's just as if they're working in their normal studio.
Gotcha. So, I mean, we're also in the midst of a pandemic where all of a sudden everybody had to figure out some kind of work from home. So I know a lot of studios have been looking at taking a measured approach to cloud adoption, and the measured approach all of a sudden got a big old push. What kind of changes have you seen in terms of people's approach to the cloud just in the last few months?
A lot of that is, like, a lot of our customers have that we've been talking to have all had kind of a 1 to 3 year plan for moving to the cloud. And so we see a lot of those same studios now are more refocusing that move and bringing those timelines up. Their acceleration, the acceleration of both interest and the adoption of the cloud is kind of what's most of the phone calls or emails that I get, because it's like, how do we make this happen today? As opposed to before, it was like, hey, we just want to start talking about it. We're interested in it. And so they want to kind of make that happen faster now.
We've had a similar experience, as Corban has described it, panicked phone calls from folks who are cut off from their facilities. It could be universities, it could be studios. And you know, they didn't necessarily intend to make such a rapid shift to the cloud, but now they're forced to do so. So it's, you know, it's something, if you haven't started sticking your toe in the cloud waters, you most certainly should begin to do so if you haven't been forced to.
Makes sense. Jeff, over to you. I'm also kind of curious if there's barriers that people thought would be there that kind of, once you just needed to get it done, kind of dropped away a little bit.
So we were lucky enough to actually start the transition a couple of years ago. So when we decided to shut the facility down, basically we were back up and running within a week. And that was mainly just try to get people settled in their home environments and their, you know, getting them set up for their work environment. So for us, it wasn't that difficult. So we were able to go through some of those growing pains over a period of 2 years, which meant when the pandemic hit, we actually decided to shut down a couple of weeks before Toronto even shut everything down. So, you know, and that's basically through a combination of remoting into the 2 facilities, and also using either NUX, connecting via Teradici to AWS. And of course, all of our data is always on both AWS and cached on our local servers as well. So the transition for us was actually pretty simple, but it does require planning. And, you know, we had the advantage of starting to look at this a couple of years ago when we were doing next gen, and we were doing that mainly for rendering purposes, but also data backup and storage. So we had a bit of a head start in heading down this road.
Nice. I feel like streaming is kind of the one big, you know, barrier that people, once they get over, they realize it can work. Because if you've got a good internet connection and you can, you know, you've got something like Teradici, you can stream that and you can have a, you know, a good size workstation in the cloud, and stream that. You could be at a Starbucks and have access to your nuke file to re-render something
on a small laptop, right?
On a Chromebook. We've experimented in the past with just like how can I run a virtual, you know, EC2 instance on a Chromebook, launch Maya or Nuke or Blender or any of those applications, and then, you know, work from there. Now, granted, Starbucks has to be not as crowded and, you know, everyone hogging it, but it is possible.
That screen shield.
Yeah.
Jeff, you were saying you finally achieved that goal of being able to run a shot from a mountain cabin.
Yeah. I was up at the lake a couple of weeks ago, visiting some relatives, and actually checked a bit of stuff out and checked it back in from the lake. So there you go, finally.
Nice. So there's a lot of studios that are still kind of working the old way and are eyeing the cloud. And I think they're seeing a lot of different possible approaches they could take to unlock cloud services. What approaches have you seen that have been the most successful? And how can a studio know if like that's the approach for them? Mark, start with you this time.
Well, we've seen studios start with maybe a small bite to start. For example, they'll submit their simulations to us. And one of the advantages of using that is once the input files for the simulations have been delivered to our cloud, then those files become very large during the simulation process. But that all remains on our data storage, not theirs. And so they don't have to upload and download very large intermediate files. And then they can kick off a dependent render. So it's a very easy process, and one that, as I said, studios typically start with in our case. And then from there, they can, they can expand the workload to do more different services. So maybe some would start with Houdini and then add Maya and those sorts of things. So typically they'll start with a slice and then expand from there. That seems to be a good practice.
Cool. Corban, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mark's kind of explaining it. It's a migration story. Planning that approach and defining what success is going to help. And, start small, start with a couple of users, start with a department, instead of just trying to do, a lift and shift, which typically, I don't think has such good success. But as you dip your toes into it, bringing in, like the lighting department or the compositing department. A lot of times it's that kind of hybrid approach of burst rendering and burst compositing, where it's real easy to turn those things around because you have access to all the, the compute behind you. I don't have to download and resync, back online. I could just start working directly from the cloud, resubmit it. And so once you get one department on, plan that next department. Is it the modelers? Is it the surfacers? Who's, and having that migration plan, I think really helps people kind of focus on where the bottlenecks are going to be, and then they can plan around those bottlenecks.
Awesome. So lighting, compositing, like good places to look first.
Yeah,
and you think it's from the compute needs that are going on over there?
It's the compute needs that kind of drive a lot of the migration. I mean, that's typically, the burst rendering, the burst compute. And so like, Mark was saying, effects, where they've got large simulations where they just want to, and those simulations create huge amounts of data. And so instead of trying to bring all that data back just to check it, you can check it in the cloud. And if it's wrong, resubmit it or redo it and go from there.
Cool. Jeff, anything to add to that one? Oh, you're still on mute, Jeff.
Yeah, I echo what both Mark and Corban have said. It was our initial move to the cloud was driven by simulations, render, but also was driven by backups, insurance, bond companies. So there was a bunch of things on that side too that sort of drove our decision to do that. And once we decided that, it became evident that the project should live in the cloud. The data should always be in the cloud, so that there is no such thing as a massive transfer of data. It's actually in the cloud already. On next gen, I think we had to transfer, I think it was like 100 terabytes of data. So we ended up using a snowball to get the data there, and that was a bit of a painful process. So that is definitely not something I would recommend, even though the product itself is interesting and a clever solution. If you can, definitely try to plan up front to integrate with cloud services.
Any other gotchas that you guys can think of?
I think the biggest gotcha that we have heard from studios is they waited too late. They waited until, it was way too late. And they ended up with a project on their doorstep that was far beyond their own capacity to handle, either because they already had projects in the pipeline and they didn't have any spare capacity to accommodate this new project, or it was just a very large project. And so I think, very, very much encourage everyone to do something, start somewhere, even if it's small, like Corban was talking about, because it will give you some practical experience, and you probably will discover that a lot of things that you thought were mountains are maybe actually molehills. So as you work your way through it, you'll then eventually get to a point where, you can handle much larger projects. In fact, it becomes then a business driver. You can start looking for bigger opportunities, more complex projects, or just more projects in general, because you now have the cloud capacity to accommodate those kind of resources.
Corban or Jeff, any other gotchas that you guys want to share with the audience?
Jeff?
No.
All right. So I think as the last of the questions that I'm going to ask before we switch over to audience questions, if you guys could just snap your fingers and change one thing about the technology that all of the studios are currently using in order to kind of help with this transition, help it realize a lot of the benefits of the world that you guys see, what would it be?
Just one?
One, I got one.
All right, we'll start with Jeff, and then Corban, you can rack your brain and then pick your top one.
Yeah, there's a bunch, but for us, it's latency. Latency is it can be a real problem for certain users depending on their internet connection. So we have some users that have incredibly low latency, so their experience is really, really good when they're using virtual workstations. Others, not so much. So the latency can be an issue. That's a difficult one to fix because that's a physical infrastructure problem.
The speed of light there.
You said if I could snap my fingers, there we go.
It's getting better. All right, Mark. Corban still looks like he's thinking.
It's not a technical thing that I would change. It's more of a, if you will, psychological thing. I think there's still a lot of concern. Obviously a lot of it founded about migrating to the cloud. But it ultimately comes down to a commitment to doing that and establishing a roadmap, as Corban mentioned, a change program, and executing it and committing to doing that. It's not insurmountable. Many people, many studios have done it, and so I think it's the wherewithal, it's the will, it's the commitment to actually make it happen. But otherwise, yeah, there are some technical barriers, like we were talking about latency. But there are good solutions out there that help with that to a large extent. I think it's more of a making that commitment and initiating that journey.
Corban, did you settle on your top choice?
Sure. I think it's making it easier. I think right now cloud accommodates mostly the technical. And I think if we can make it where it accommodates more both the technical and the non-technical, it should just be easy as launching a workstation and starting it up and having access to whichever machine type I want, whichever software I want, whichever storage solution I want. And I think like we continue to make more investment in that area, but it's still not there yet. And whether it's certain kinds of storage, like having DCC apps support like object or block-based storage, as opposed to just POSIX-based storage. Licensing, I think we're heading in that direction with licensing. Like, the ISVs and the DCC apps have a good render model. And I think what we want to see in the future is the entitlement process just becomes easier, so that I can click and start using the software application, when I need it and go from there. There's a lot of things we can do to make it better, but I think we're really at day one for this, and so I think it's just a matter of over the next few years you'll start to see a lot of investment in this area.
Yep, that makes sense. I think might not have been your top ones, Jeff and Mark, but I know when we were talking earlier, licensing as a pain point definitely came up. Wanting the editors to be able to talk to cloud storage definitely came up. All right, cool. Satish, you want to come on up and feed us our first crowd question?
All right, so this first question, it has the most votes. So this is, will you share like the lessons learned from like transitioning to cloud native pipeline? What should we prepare if we want to go through this process from going on-site pipeline to a cloud native pipeline?
All right, any particular lessons or pitfalls to avoid? Jeff?
So I will give, the first thing we did was we actually found some contractors that had experience that helped and it sped up our transition to the cloud. Otherwise, you're sitting there learning the various systems and the managed services and things yourself. So find like Mark, for instance, find a contractor or a company that can actually help you in that transition. Now, it's a cost, of course, but when you look at the cost of how long it would take you to get to the cloud yourself, in some cases, it's a time saver and a money saver. So,
any particular pitfalls other than not talking to the folks who've gone through the process before?
You have to watch costs. You definitely have to watch costs on things like egress. You have to watch costs on data transfer between different data centers. That caught us by surprise a couple times as well. So, you know, it's not like it's difficult, but there are a lot of things to navigate as you move to the cloud.
Corban, any kind of hints or pitfalls? And since, you know, we're part of the pipeline conference, I'll toss in anything kind of on the pipeline level that the folks that are writing those pipelines could do in order to kind of be cloud friendly.
Yeah, I think the thing that I've noticed is that a lot of people try to lift and shift a workflow that has been, you know, built around an on-prem single namespace kind of file system approach, you know, and it's because it's what they're used to. It's what they're accustomed to. They've been working like this for the last, you know, in my case, way too many years. But I think it's if you take a more cloud native approach, you know, think of this as, instead of being file system based where you're trolling files and pathing, you're more service based, relying on microservices that can help kind of drive those pipeline tasks and tools, you know, and thinking of as an asset as a
Cumulo,
more
for instance,
thing.
right?
As a what?
Like Cumulo, for instance, for helping with the file. Yeah.
So if you take a more cloud native approach, you get to take advantage of all the kind of tools and software that have been done, you know, for the cloud. And a lot of them are open source. A lot of them are easily accessible. And so, you know, take advantage of kind of what's already been done out there and approach it differently. Because I think you'll get better success taking advantage of what the cloud can offer versus trying to shove what was traditionally an on-prem pipeline into the cloud. Sometimes that can work, but most times you wind up kind of running into problems that just you don't notice that you have on-prem.
Cool. And Jeff, Cumulo, you describe what that is.
It's just a mechanism to help data transfer between local filers and S3 storage and things like that. So it also deals with things like caching for EC2 instances. So, and again, it's one of these things that if you had to write that stuff yourself, it would be very complex. So there are many little managed services like that on AWS that we take advantage of.
Cool. And Mark, any best practices?
Nothing to add. I think that they're all really good comments. Only GridMarkets can help with that process if anyone's interested. But I think, you know, those are all good suggestions and preparation ideas that have been offered.
Awesome. Thanks. Satish, what's up next?
All right. Next up is so it's a aggregation of two questions. So basically, like security certification with the studios, and also like about redundancy. How do you maintain redundancy? Because if something happens, all right. About security and redundancy.
Keeping the IP safe and making sure availability and uptime is there. Mark, we'll start over with you this time.
Redundancy, that's one of the reasons I would encourage folks to consider using the cloud, because compared to a local company, the cloud vendor is probably much more adept and capable of ensuring the redundancy of your data and the security of it, frankly, because they typically are, AWS, for example, is making huge investments in that sort of requirement, whereas typically that investment would dwarf any investment that a studio would make. So I think, if you're looking for security and redundancy, definitely look at the cloud as a solution for that.
Corban, anything to add from the amount that AWS pays attention to this?
Well, yeah, security obviously is a priority for us. But I like Mark's answer in the sense that it's, we go to the cloud for that redundancy and for that backup because, we've built that infrastructure in there to support that. I think security is a big one in the sense that, if you look at AWS, we have government, we have healthcare, we have banking, we have a lot of the M&E customers are using AWS. And so a lot of those services are already offering, applications to their clients. And so there's already a level of security built into clouds. But part of that also is a shared responsibility with the customer and with the client. So to being able to make sure that you're building your pipeline in a way, or your virtual studio, that is taken, that is being safe. You don't have open ports. You don't have, typical things that you would do on-prem as well. We're also working with the Trusted Partner Network, and making sure that we're following that and just helping out as much as we can there. So,
and MPAA as well, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so similar comments from me as well. One of the reasons for us to go to the cloud was for redundancy and for backup. Our IT staff, even though we're well over 300 people, is very, very small, because the majority of because of the various services that we're using on Amazon and the fact that we have completely transitioned to a cloud workflow. I don't have any issues whatsoever with the level of security on the at least on AWS. So,
in terms of TPN or MPAA certification, have you guys seen success with those kinds of programs and kind of the vendors meeting the needs and the studios trusting that kind of certification? Corban?
I think that's part of what TPN is actually working on. The MPA is, you don't get credentials from the MPA. You can be compliant with what their standards are. And I think part of that is some clients are much more sensitive, and others are, aren't as sensitive. And I think a lot of times, when you show them the security levels that you take, they're going to be either happier or they're not. And I think that's almost a learning thing. That's, the security is out there, it can handle it. It's just whether or not the clients that you're working with are comfortable.
Yeah, and MPAA and TPN, like there are levels of compliance as well that the various clients will accept. So it's not like you have to be right across the board and be able to handle all of that. So as a studio, one of the things that we've also done is we've actually employed ethical hackers to try and find holes in our system, both on the internal side and on the AWS side. So, if you want to go the nth degree, there's another way to take a look at it as well.
Yeah, and when we were back at Nimble, we actually went through ISC, which is a company down.
That was the one we used.
Yeah, down in LA, and they poke holes in your system. They look through your code. They go through everything to just, here's a possible security thing. And and the idea is that there's not 100% security. That there never will be, but you can get that number pretty high. And they basically just find all the areas that you need to improve this, improve that, and that's by third-party auditors. And so then that you can give to your clients and say, yeah, we've been audited by a third-party, security group that's just their job. And it works out really well.
Nice. Mark, anything to add for that?
I just think obviously the TPN initiative is a really important one for the industry. It will create the framework that will allow the industry to have the confidence to ultimately move to the cloud. This particular industry is probably, by comparison to others, a laggard, in part because there are those missing security frameworks that can give the end user the confidence they need. So I'd encourage everyone to participate in this and help to shape it. It's a really important initiative.
Cool. Thanks. All right, Satish.
All right, the next question is, it has 22 words, so I think we need to discuss this. So do you have any concerns regarding clients working through NDAs? Is there any form of accountability if data is leaked?
I think one thing is to be working in the cloud, you don't have to have remote workforces. Like, I think one of the misnomers is that you can still have a cloud-based virtual studio and still be in the same building. And so I think it's one of the things from a security standpoint where I have the flexibility, if I have a virtual studio, to just go home and continue working. I can hire freelancers or remote global workforces, or have a larger pool and access to that pool. But I can also still be on-prem, in the same room, in the same building, and just have the virtual studio and have that flexibility if I need it. So it doesn't mean that you have to have that, but at some point, if you have somebody working on it or working on a project that is external, it's a freelancer, or somebody goes home, they can always take a picture of it with their camera or their phone. And so part of it is just trust, and sometimes that is enough, and sometimes that isn't.
Well, part of that's also the contract too, right? There are legal ramifications for doing that. But in terms of using virtual workstations as well, there is no data that transfers down to whoever's on the other side of that connection. So other than taking a picture, I mean, that's about all you can do to leak.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to convey briefly the story of a conversation I had recently with a producer in India who was talking about lamenting, I guess, the fact that the large studios around him were hoovering up all the talent, and he was left with very little talent in his immediate area. And so the cloud for him and having a virtual studio allowed him to source and plug in talent from anywhere in the world. And he could more precisely choose the skill sets that he needed for a particular part of the project. So it actually became empowering for him to do this, to be able to bring people in as he needed them, put them under NDA, obviously. But in the end, it was a much more enabling capability than the alternative, which was to try to source those folks from his local community. It became impossible, actually.
Yeah, and just to kind of follow up, I like that more precisely, to choose the type of task that certain artists works on. You can also more precisely choose the data that they have access to. Yeah. So I can share only a subset of the data, so I can limit my blast range, my blast radius in terms of who has access to what data. And that's really important. So I'm not going to give access to, freelancer to the entire film, but I may give them access to the particular data that they need to work on that task. And so if that data gets out, I now have a better idea of who was working on that and when. But again, I think it goes back to a lot of just trust. I think that's part of the thing that you have to take into it.
All right, thanks.
All right. The next one, so I'm just going to the end of the question list to find some of the later posted ones. So this is about how do you perform deliveries to a post house if all your data is in the cloud? And if, say, the post house is not on the cloud. So how does that work?
So there's a couple approaches you could take. There's lots of tools. If they're a company that doesn't have internet access, which I think is hard to imagine, but if that's the case, you can always download the data and send it to them on a hard drive. But assuming that they have internet access, you can expose certain parts of your data. And from a virtual workstation, I can bring up, for example, Aspera, and I could stream, a lot of companies like Technicolor and stuff like that, have Aspera systems or accounts where that's how they transfer data back and forth. And whether that's going from on-prem to Technicolor or it's going from our account in the cloud to Technicolor, it's the same thing. As a matter of fact, it's actually faster because we don't have to go through the upload. It's already on the backplane of AWS. So getting it to the client is actually a lot quicker.
I think I'd like to echo that. I think this is, again, an area where cloud excels. It brings capabilities that would be much more difficult to make available if you were using a local architecture. It's much easier to share data. Obviously, there's some cautions that go around that. But in our case, basically, the end user designates a destination directory for us to download the results of their simulations or the renders, whatever it might be, and they can choose wherever that destination is. So it's very easy to do.
I'll add in, I've talked with studios, and if you're going from someone that has a cloud workflow to somebody that has a cloud workflow, then if you're kind of doing a handoff S3 bucket to S3 bucket, it's kind of ridiculous how fast you can hand over terabytes of data in a secure way.
Yeah.
All right. Satish.
So the next one is with all the data and compute migrating to the cloud, in part or in full, how do you develop the pipeline in the cloud to connect the workflows efficiently?
All right, Jeff, maybe a little bit deeper into what is it about the pipeline that lets you access cloud services efficiently?
I'm not totally sure what the question is.
So say, part of your data is in the cloud, and some of the work is still happening outside of cloud. So how do you, create a pipeline that, bridges non-cloud and cloud?
We don't do that. So
Okay.
basically for us, we see local workstations or local filers as being caches. So you may pull some data to a local workstation in order to work on it, or you may actually work on it on an EC2 or like a graphics enabled workstation on Amazon. Our local filers are really just caches, so that when our system looks for a particular file, it looks at all the locations, determine who has the most up-to-date one, and if it's AWS and not the others, then it basically brings that down and refreshes the local cache and then brings it to the workstation. So we don't have a split workflow. So it's hard for me to answer this because ours is fully dependent upon being cloud enabled.
I like that answer. I mean, I think it's, you know, if you break your pipeline down to be task based, and as long as you have access to all the files that are needed for that task, it doesn't really matter where it lives, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. Yeah. As long as the working, you know, if you want to call it a sandbox, or the working kind of location of where that artist will have access to that data is if it's there. So you should build a pipeline around, you know, making sure that the data, because the data could live anywhere. And, you know, if you think of this as like, you know, Dropbox or Google Drive, like, you know, you don't really know where that physical file lives in Google Drive, you know, or in Dropbox, but you know how to get to it. And as long as you have the you know, the APIs and the connections to find that piece of data, the URI or whatever, and pull it down or put it to your local sandbox, then you'll have access to it.
Yeah, that's pretty much what we've done with our software. It's basically one massive a distributed version control system. So the data does, you know, ultimately all the data lives on AWS. The data may also live in multiple other locations, but it's not necessary for it to live in those locations because it will refresh it as required.
Makes sense. And I think we're coming up at the end of our time, so this may be the last one. Satish, I saw there was a follow-up to, if you could snap your fingers. Jeff, you were talking about latency being one of the major things. So given that there is latency, how do you, what's the question? What are the right practices to reduce latency when providing services for artists working on assets?
It really just comes down to internet connection. There are, as Mark was saying, there are ways to mitigate some of the issues. I can't remember what the technology is called on the NUCs, but the help me out here, Corban or Mark. You know, the cursor, the local, what is it called? Local termination for cursors.
Local, yep.
Is that what it is? Yeah.
Yep. Local termination.
Yeah. So that does help with the user experience, but at the end of the day, I'd say the majority of our artists are fine. Sometimes the art department works local, like on their local machines as opposed to on virtual workstations, because there is a latency, you know, especially when using Cintiqs or tablets. Pretty much every other department is fine with it, but yeah, I don't know. There is really, I don't think there's any magic solution to the latency issues, and it can also change day to day. So,
I mean, the big part of that is your internet connection. You know, if you've got fiber at home, or if you've got DSL or cable, like all those have different pros and cons. You know, just working at home during this whole pandemic, I think some of the things that we run into, you know, at AWS is like whether or not my kids are playing Minecraft and Roblox at the same time. You know, or my wife is, you know, streaming.
4K stream.
Or, and you know, and the other one is it's sometimes simple. It's like I have a laptop, and if I'm walking around the house, there's latency between that and the router. So being plugged in, if I'm doing any latency sensitive type work, I want to be plugged in directly into the router so that I'm not hitting that extra bit of latency. Because, you know, it going from like 15 milliseconds down to 10 milliseconds might make all the difference in the world for an artist that's using brushes and a pin, you know, Wacom. Whereas something like, you know, 20 to 50 milliseconds might not be as big a deal for somebody that's doing animation or lighting or something like that.
Modeling or something like that.
Or modeling or, you know, texture painting, as long as they're getting kind of the real-time feedback. But for editing and things that are like storyboarding or drawing, they're going to be much more sensitive to that kind of latency. So every little bit definitely helps.
The way we address this is effectively by creating a resource pool within the vicinity of the end user. So if they're European based, the resource pool would come from Europe. they're North American based, you know, it would come from there, which, you know, helps to reduce that, the number of hops and the latency requirements.
Yeah, you know, just one little anecdotal thing. From our Toronto office, because we have a direct connect to AWS, we've seen latency as low as 6 to 7 milliseconds, which is amazing.
Wow.
But that's if you're in our office. So.
All right. Well, we are out of time. Thanks everybody for the discussion. Jeff, Corban, Mark, Satish. This was a great conversation. So
Thanks for hosting us,
everybody. And
Thanks to
the next
all the
session
attendees
is starting up.
Cool.
All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Yep.